So we've talked about red blood cells and how they transport oxygen. Now we want to focus on white blood cells and how they and their defense against disease. So white blood cells, also known as leukocytes, have very large cells. Compared to our red blood cells, these are going to be massive. They also have a nucleus. They contain all of those missing organelles that our red blood cells do not. They are translucent unless they're stained, and we've categorized them based on their staining patterns, which I'm not going to expect you to memorize. But they are also going to be produced in the red bone marrow, just like our red blood cells are, and their production is going to be regulated by colony stimulating factor, CSF. This is just going to play, it's a hormone that helps us regulate the production of white blood cells. It's going to help fight infection and is going to play a very important part of our immune system because of its production of white blood cells. Some of our white blood cells are only going to live for a few days. Others are going to live for months to years, depending on what their function is. We're not going to spend a lot of time going into the different categories. I do want you to just briefly review them. The white blood cells, I'm not going to expect you to memorize the difference between neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils, lymphocytes, monocytes. But I do want you to know some of these functions. So some of these white blood cells are able to phagocytize pathogens and cellular debris. So if you remember back when we talked about transport across the plasma membrane, we talked about endocytosis and exocytosis and phagocytosis and pinocytosis. Well, some white blood cells are able to phagocytize pathogens and cellular debris, which is pretty awesome. Eosinophils use their granular contents to digest large pathogens like worms or large sort of parasites. Basophils promote blood cell to injured tissues and help aid in the inflammatory response. Lymphocytes are going to be responsible for specific immunity. So there are B cells, which produce antibodies, T cells, which destroy cancer and virus-infected cells. They're going to play a huge, huge role in our immune system, which we'll see a little bit later. And then our monocytes, which become macrophages that phagocytize pathogens and cellular debris. So like I said, I'm not going to quiz you about the individual white blood cells, but I do want you to know some of the general functions that we can find with those white blood cells. So like I said, we have a lot of different white blood cells. They're going to be categorized by their appearance. We have the granular leukocytes and the agranular leukocytes. That A prefix just means without or non. So we have our granular and our non-granular leukocytes. The neutrophils are going to be the very most abundant white blood cells. There are about 50 to 70% of all white blood cells are our neutrophils. They have a multi-lobed nucleus, so they're very complex in structure, and they're going to be our very first responders to bacterial infections. They help engulf pathogens by phagocytosis, and they can actually leave the bloodstream, so they're found in the interstitial fluid and lymph. I just kind of want to show you an image of what that looks like. So here are our neutrophils. They can actually pass between the cell walls, the cell membranes of adjacent cells. So here's our blood. This is our capillary. Like we said, the capillary walls are only one cell thick, and the white blood cells can actually squeeze through these openings, kind of like an octopus, and leak out into the interstitial fluid and fight infection there, which is pretty awesome. So they can leave the bloodstream, and they're found in interstitial fluid and lymph. Our eosinophils, those are going to have a bilobed nucleus, meaning that the nucleus is separated into two lobes. They have a lot of very large granules, and those granules can play an important role in fighting off parasitic infections and in fighting off allergies. Basophils are going to be the very rarest of our white blood cells. They have a U-shaped or lobed nucleus, and they're found in connective tissues. Those basophils and mast cells can release a histamine during allergic reactions. That histamine dilates blood vessels, but it constricts the breathing passageways. So like during an asthma attack, that's caused by our basophils acting up. Lymphocytes, they make up about 25 to 35% of all white blood cells, so they are extremely common as well. Of course, not as common as those neutrophils, but they are very common. There are two main types, as I mentioned previously, B and T cells. B cells, when they mature, can produce antibodies, which mark a pathogen for destruction, help us fight off infection. They play a very important role in our immune system in helping us fight off infections that we may have seen before. Some T cells can destroy pathogens directly, so those are B and T lymphocytes. Next up, we have our monocytes. Our monocytes are going to be the largest of the white blood cells. In tissues, they can develop into even larger macrophages, which can engulf pathogens, old cell, and debris. So like I said, here is the diagram of our blood capillary and our white blood cells that can actually pass through the openings in the cell walls. There are a couple of disorders that are involving the white blood cells. Severe combined immunodeficiency disease, or SCID, is an inherited disease in which those lymphocytes don't develop properly, and so your body is not able to fight off infection. Leukemia is a group of cancers in which white blood cells proliferate without control. Most of those white blood cells are abnormal, so they don't function well. So not only do you have an overabundance of white blood cells, but they're not actually functioning the way they're supposed to. So they are either over-attacking the human body, or they are not attacking any infection at all, leaving your immune system incredibly weak and exposed. There's also infectious mononucleosis. You may have also heard this referred to as mono. This is caused by the Epstein-Barr virus, EBV. It can infect lymphocytes. This can result in extreme fatigue, sore throat, and swollen lymph nodes. All right, so you should be able to explain why there are different types of white blood cells and the structure. And it does say that one of the objectives for this section is to describe the structure and function of each major class of white blood cell. I'm not going to ask you to do that, but I do want you to be familiar with all of the different functions that white blood cells may have. All right, and then go over and make sure you review in this particular section, just review briefly the relationship between leukemia and white blood cells and how the overproduction of one results in the other. All right, and that's it for chapter 6.3.